Good morning. Welcome to the Point. Well, this week in Lansing, there was a lot of talk about the budget, just like there was the week before and the week before that. And just like there will be in the weeks to come, because now that there are three budgets, more or less, a Senate version, a House version, and of course, the governor laid her version out back in March. Now it will go into the negotiation phase. Exactly where will the spending go? How much will the spending be? Will there be new revenues? And specifically, what happens to things like schools and, perhaps most important, roads? It will be up to the legislative leaders and the governor to work out some kind of a plan. As for the rest of the legislature, there's a summer break coming up, but there are also a lot of tentative days on the calendar, so they could be called back. As to how often they'll be in Lansing, it's just unclear, but we'll keep you updated. We talked to two state representatives this morning, and yes, we do talk about the budget, but we also talk about some of the other things they'd like to get done while that budget is pending. We start with State Representative Thomas Albert. Representative, I ask you this first question a little bit on a personal note because it's summertime, which for those of us that have little kids, that can also be carnival time or amusement park time. And I know you have legislation that has now gotten a committee hearing to talk about encouraging more safety precautions when it comes to both amusement parks and those traveling carnivals that may be at your local county fair. Tell me what your legislation would do and kind of why you came up with that idea.
Well, actually, I didn't come up with it. This is a pretty good example of a constituent coming to my office hours, and she told of a pretty tragic incident that happened to her sister at a local amusement park. And we did a deep dive into what happened, into what Michigan's regulations are, and we came to the conclusion that we can do more. So what this proposed legislation would do is it would create basically an incentive program. Let's give businesses a reason to participate. So if they go above and beyond for training, for safety, emergency procedures, they'll get recognized for that. It's modeled after what they do in North Carolina. It creates a STAR program. That way vendors can put a star with a flag, or a flag with a star on it at their location, and patrons will know, hey, this is a place that's gone above and beyond. For those traveling carnivals that we all are so familiar with, many of those, I assume, are within the state, some are outside of the state. Would those regulations pertain just to the ones here, or those incentives, that program be just for in-state vendors? It would be for both. If they're operating within the state, it would apply to them. The 86th district, which I represent, is pretty blessed. We actually have two county fairs. We have the Kent County Youth Fair in Lowell, and we have the Ionia Free Fair, and they're very important to our community and to our history. And I'm a parent. All the parents go there and they send their kids on these rides. We just want to make sure that we're doing the best we can to ensure safety. So you've had a hearing, so it's still in committee, I assume? Still in committee, yep. Okay, and so this is something that could be voted on before the break, assuming that there's going to be a break, or sometime later in this session? I think it's going to take a little bit of time, but I'm optimistic we can get this done before the term's up. Let's talk about something else that is completely separate, but it has to do with kind of an emerging force in the state with the legalization of marijuana after the last election cycle. And you've taken steps to create some awareness surrounding that. Talk to me about your efforts with marijuana. Well, I was contacted by a doctor actually last term. This is the second iteration of trying to get this bill done, but he had expressed some concerns with pregnant women continuing to use marijuana while they're pregnant. And I looked more into it, and it's actually a pretty growing problem. If you look at alcohol and cigarette use amongst pregnant women, it's actually trending down. But when you look at marijuana, it's actually trending up. About 1 in 20 women are thought to be using marijuana while they're pregnant. So what this bill would do is it would create a warning label that would be placed much like on cigarettes or alcohol products, just warning mothers that there can be some long-term developmental problems, or it can create low birth weight. So we're just trying to make sure that women understand what the potential effects could be to the children. And this doctor, I assume, brought that to your attention, that these things exist out there. Is that broadly accepted in the medical community, that marijuana does pose risks to unborn children? Yes. The medical community had a hearing this week. They came and supported the bills. I would like to see that get done. One thing I think was pretty shocking is there was a study done last year in Colorado. A researcher randomly called 400 dispensaries in Colorado. And the woman who called had said, "Hey, I'm having morning sickness, would marijuana help?" And 7 in 10 of the dispensaries said, yes, this would be a good product. And a third of those dispensaries went as far as to say marijuana was safe to use while pregnant. And my wife wouldn't even eat fish or drink coffee when she was pregnant. So I think we have to go a little bit further to explain to the public that these could be harmful.
The overarching thing that you and I have talked about in the past, one of the reasons you're here, is that you're interested in retirement funds, the liabilities, and all of those things that go on, and that is kind of an ongoing battle for you. Talk to me about your concerns about that as it pertains to both retirees and the retirement system.
I think the best way to explain it is we raised about $13.5 billion for the school aid fund through state revenues. About 26 cents on the dollar is going to the retirement fund. That's a substantial amount of funding that's being siphoned away from the classroom. I worked in finance before this. I actually worked at the pension fund, and when you look at the debt structure, it's not designed like our home mortgage. It's not a fixed loan that you pay the same amount every month. They actually designed it so we're going to pay more later. The idea was, well, we'll have more money later. Let's pay more of the debt later. So I have some very serious concerns about the sustainability of that debt structure, and I've been chipping away at it, and I'm hoping to make some progress.
Well, what would an answer be? Because I know during the previous administration there were efforts made to try to catch up with the unfunded liabilities that the state had, and the governor used to talk about 2034 or 2032, somewhere in there, having caught up if the budget stayed on the same trajectory for that period of time. How do you overcome that instability?
Well, so one thing that I introduced a package of bills. One thing that I think we need to do, so as you said, the debt's right now designed to expire or be all paid off by the year 2038. But what's going to happen if we get to the year 2030 or 2034 and we have a few bad investment years? Those debt payments could grow by billions of dollars. So I think the first thing we need to do is let's isolate this debt that we have here. Let's make sure we pay that off by 2038. Any new debt that's created, we'll pay that off in different sections. If we have debt this year, we'll pay that off in 10 years. Next year, another 10 years. So I think what we kind of have to do first is isolate the problem.
So are you talking about physically separating existing pensions from any current that would be incurred?
It would be a different debt structure. It's quite common in the finance industry and in the pension world. It's actually called layered amortization. So it's just a way to isolate the problem.
So when you talk about these kind of things, one of the questions that's often come to me as a reporter covering legislators who are term limited, who will not be here in 2038 to worry about that problem. How do you get people to focus on something that isn't happening, at least in front of them today?
Well, I served in the Marine Corps, so I do a pretty good job at making my opinions known and raising a fuss if I need to, because it's just too important. We're talking about future resources to educate our children. I have 3 kids from the ages of 7 to 2 years old. We're not going to have this debt paid off by the time they graduate from high school, so I'd like to at least be able to, for my grandkids, to be able to have this debt, at least something sustainable.
But it is kind of a learning curve for some members, with no disrespect to them, and for some reporters too, because it's baked into the budget process. It's already in the system. So unless you make note of it, as the previous administration did, as you have and continue to, it's really not something that's front and center unless you are personally involved in it. So it is an awareness as well, right?
So yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because there's one of the bills would it basically create a legislative auditor. Because right now, one problem I've seen is we're given the bill from the administration. We don't have any check and balance on that. We're given a bill and we pay it. Well, one of the reasons that we've created $40 billion of debt was the bill we were given was not calculated properly. Our investment returns ended up being way off. So what we'd like to do is let's make sure we have someone who's on our side in the legislature who's basically double checking this math.
When you talk about with your fellow legislators, and I mean, obviously, this is a statewide issue because it deals with every school district in the state. Are they, I hate to use the word, up to speed? Are they on board? Do others recognize this problem in sufficient numbers that you can get traction with this?
I would say administrators do. Administrators are very well aware of the financial impacts. I mean, you're looking at just over $2,000 per student that gets sent back to the pension fund. Does it trickle down to the parents? No, I don't think there's quite that level of awareness.
Finally, as we wrap up, and of course we'll have many more conversations, as you and I sit here, we're coming within a few session days of what would have been summer break, what I suspect will still be a summer break. But a bunch of days have been added to the calendar as tentative days because there is not, and from my observational position, appears there will not be a budget deal done before that break time comes around. Is that a fair assessment from your standpoint?
Well, I'd say plan for the worst and hope for the best. So the tentative dates have been added to the calendar, but I'm hoping we can get the budget done as soon as possible.
And is it fair to assume that at least one of the biggest sticking points is still going to be roads, infrastructure, raising new or not raising new revenues for those roads?
Yeah, I think that's fair assessment. I mean, if you look at what the governor proposed, it was basically a tax-heavy new revenue strategy. And if you look at what the House has proposed, it's looking at our existing budgets and let's see where we can use existing revenue.
As we said at the top of the show, in Lansing right now, it's pretty much all about the budget, and that's the way it will stay until some type of a budget deal is reached. But when the legislators come back in the fall, they could start looking at some of those initiatives that Representative Albert was talking about and a whole lot more things on their agenda. But for now, they're keeping an eye on that budget, as are we. When we come back, more budget talk with one of the appropriators. Next, To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. This morning we're talking with two members of the State House of Representatives. You just heard from Republican Representative Thomas Albert. Now it's Democrat Rachel Hood's turn. She's a freshman in the legislature and on the Appropriations Committee, and we talk about the massive job of trying to put together a budget, particularly for the very first time. Representative, let's talk about a big issue for every member, but for a freshman, it's got to be kind of a big lift when you talk about being on appropriations and doing the budget.
Sure.
The process as we sit here today is not done, likely won't be for a while, but it doesn't mean that it won't ultimately get done, because it will ultimately get done. What's that process been like, and where have you found some successes? I know one of those that you mentioned before we went on was the Veterans Home in Grand Rapids. Not just in Grand Rapids, but obviously that's a major concern for our viewers and particularly for you and your district.
Sure. Well, I've been incredibly impressed by how smoothly the process has moved and the amount of information that we have from the House Fiscal Office and from other, legislative policy staff has been phenomenal. To take so much detail and boil it down so that we can navigate it and, learn the process has been great. The legislative process is also fascinating. It's been fascinating to see how the subcommittees on appropriations are formed, what the balance is between the majority and the minority. And then, working in the minority, of course, has a lot of challenges. We don't have a lot of wins, but understanding the strategy that goes behind the wins that we are able to achieve has been a great opportunity for learning. And it's a space I was really passionate to dig into because I feel like our budget and revenue issues are the heart of the matter here in Michigan, whether it's schools or roads. It comes down to dollars. So being able to represent the 76th district and articulate what our priorities are through the lens of the budget has been a great honor. Of course, one of those priorities was the Grand Rapids Veterans Home. Across the board, the Republicans proposed 3% administrative cuts and then 25% IT cuts. And in addition to that, there was a $400,000 cut to the homes themselves. So I was successful in restoring those cuts in the veterans budget, and for the homes specifically, not across the whole budget, but for the Jacob Betty home in Marquette and for the home for the veterans in Grand Rapids. And of course, I think we can all agree that taking care of the people who served us so valiantly is a priority for us. We need to make sure that the care and the improvements that continue for veterans in our district, but also across the state, continues to move forward in a positive trajectory. And we need to get ready for the next generation of veterans who will be arriving at the doorsteps of these homes in the next decade. And making sure that we have strong systems in place is just critical. We had a recent audit of the Department of Veterans Affairs and of the home, and some items popped up there, but I'm really impressed with how quickly the staff have been moving to address those items and set up new systems. They're really using the audit to learn and to improve processes and practices, and that's all we can ask of any of the professionals who work for the state of Michigan, to have an attitude of an ethic and a culture of continuous improvement.
Well, and when you talk about the veterans' homes now, we talk about them as two, but that will be expanding as the
Yes.
process goes forward to better serve all areas of the state of Michigan. And that also changes the dynamic of the vets home in Grand Rapids. So
Yeah.
all of this is happening kind of all at once, with the audit coming out, trying to, as you point out, improve those processes, but also kind of shifting the focus of how they're going to do things. So there are a lot of changes going on there.
Right, so a lot of physical changes at the Grand Rapids home. If you drive by today, you'll see a lot of construction happening. And what is happening is that several smaller units have been built that will be in better alignment with best practices in patient care and in senior housing. It will provide more independence and more privacy for members at the home. As I mentioned, brings it up to 21st century standards of care, and still maintains that really strong community. Over the last few months, I've been able to visit the veterans and have coffee with them, celebrate the groundbreaking for those projects. And I've just been continually impressed with the volunteers and the staff there who are so passionate about making sure that the Veterans Home is a happy place to live. It's great to see, and I think the improvements will be a great benefit to the people who come to the facility. And the goal is to move from, having two large facilities where you have joint rooms, and, I believe at one point the Veterans Home had over 400 individuals living there. That meant that families had to come, drive hours across the state in order to visit their veteran and stay in touch with them. As we move forward, we'll be building multiple smaller units across the state, so that no one's more than 2 hours away from their loved one.
Let's talk a little bit further about the budget. There are other things we want to talk about, but I can't move on before we talk about some of the unsettled items that will probably carry on somewhat into the summer. And a couple of those, one, there was a big demonstration this week about education. And some very dedicated educators were on the lawn promoting the idea that the legislature should fund education at the level that the governor proposed in her budget. And of course, the other is about roads. And there's still a pretty big gap on both of those issues when it comes to what the governor asked for, what the legislature has proposed. We've got multiple proposals out there, understanding we're just now getting into conference. Where are we, and how difficult is it going to be, or how easy, to close those gaps and come to consensus, do you believe?
Well, we are probably 4 weeks away from the possibility of closing out the budget, and I think the big question is revenue. and then subsequently, depending on the amount of revenue that we're able to agree on and the sources, how we will fund schools and roads, those big ticket items that have been suffering from decades of disinvestment in Michigan. I think that I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to come to agreement. I think, we have the executive budget. Right below that, kind of splitting the middle and the numbers, is the Senate recommendation, and then the House is the most conservative recommendation. So that signals to me that there's a lot of room for a negotiation, and we'll be looking to our leaders, the leaders of each of the chambers and the governor, to do their best work over the next few weeks. So while you and I are kicking up our heels on the beach and watching some fireworks, they're going to be hard at work, talking with each other, keeping doors open, and hopefully coming to a resolution that works for Michigan. I guess my biggest concern is that we really do need to take some significant leaps forward on revenue. We have a $60 billion budget, a large portion of that being federal dollars that move through the state. About $10 billion of those dollars are the state's contribution to the overall budget. And it's the same number, roughly, that it was 20 years ago. And so if we had just grown revenue in the state, we would have about $6 billion more if we had just grown it along with inflation to add into the budget. And that would have gone a long way to solve some of the issues with school funding and with roads funding. We have to play catch up because we do have lost decades of revenue growth. Partially, of course, because of difficult economic times in 08, 09, 10, but also because there has been this fever to keep tax burdens very, very low. People in my district are middle of the road folks, and they realize that we need new revenue in the state to make the important investments that will keep us competitive into the future. We cannot continue to underfund our kids. We're below the national average in funding, in per pupil funding for our kids. We're absolutely failing special ed kids throughout the state as well. And it boils down to a funding issue. And then, everybody has their sad story about how the roads have impacted their personal budgets unexpectedly because of an accident or a lost tire or an axle that busted. We can spend dollars preventatively and invest in our state's infrastructure, or we can spend it after the fact. And my district would like to make those preventative investments.
The interesting part about that conversation is whatever side of the equation you're on, it still comes down to 56 votes in the House. Mm-hmm. And getting 56 votes on a revenue increase. I'm not suggesting the 45-cent gasoline tax that the governor had proposed, but getting 56 votes in that chamber on a revenue increase is always an uphill battle.
I'm sure.
and it will remain. I want to move on to one other thing real quickly because we have used a lot of time on this, which I think is vitally important. But I want to talk just a little bit about auto no-fault insurance from this standpoint. Mm-hmm. From the standpoint that that gives me as an observer some hope that the majority leader in the Senate and the Speaker of the House and the governor have developed a rapport in which they can come to a consensus where they've developed a little trust, and that may bode well as the budget process goes along. But that agreement was not one that you were particularly fond of. In fact, you gave a pretty clear-eyed speech on the floor when auto no-fault came up, talking about not just the changes it may have for individuals, but talking about your districts, the service providers, the people that provide vital services for people. Mm-hmm. Tell me about the auto no-fault reform as signed into law from your perspective, and what troubles you about that.
Sure. Well, our auto no-fault insurance bills Previously, we invested about $200 per insurance policy on catastrophic care. About 40% of our bills goes to personal injury protection, and then 60% of the bill is kind of a mishmash of a whole bunch of different fees and services that in total make up our auto no-fault insurance bills. So some of the concerns that I had is one, on the PIP side of the bill. My colleagues on the Republican side were very interested in providing consumers with choice to be able to choose a level of care. So now individuals will be able to move from having full catastrophic coverage in the event of an accident. They'll be able to reduce their coverage to $50,000 if they're on Medicaid or Medicare, $250,000, $500,000, or unlimited coverage. As you know, we have very high auto insurance rates in the state, and so my fear is that many people, without understanding all of the complexities of what happens during a catastrophic auto accident, folks will be encouraged to reduce their coverage in order to reduce their payments. And while we've put some, I'll call them moderate controls on the PIP side of the bill, that 40% of your bill, there isn't much control over that 60% of the bill. So as it stands now, the auto insurance loan, I don't believe it fully, it doesn't, the promise of reduced rates is a false one. It's limited. The insurance companies may reduce your PIP bill, but they can still mess with your bill on the 60% side. There are a lot of loopholes around these non-driving factors like zip codes and age discrimination and more. So I don't think we got really strong language on that. And then we gave up a whole lot in terms of protection. And in my floor speech, I shared my own family's experience with an accident that could have threatened my husband's ability to get back into the workforce and to be the entrepreneur and the job maker that he is today. I then explained his sister's accident, which was far more catastrophic than his, and how she had to fight in the courts in California to get reimbursement for the costs of her care and her rehabilitation. So then there's the secondary issue that you mentioned. In Grand Rapids, we're home to one of the finest rehabilitation facilities in the country, Mary Free Bed. We also have Hope Network's services for secondary trauma. These folks play a critical role in bringing people back into productivity after the worst has occurred. And the bills only support 50%, 55% of their expenses. So we're essentially asking them to rehab the same people with half the money. And that isn't fair. And what will happen is that Michigan's best practices and level of care in our expertise in rehab will quickly erode. And we won't have those services anymore. For us in the district, that means a lot of lost jobs. But it also means that people may have to travel in order to get the appropriate rehab if they have a catastrophic accident. And that we won't have the level of talent and the level of care available to us that we have now, which is quite a gift for the state of Michigan. I think we could have done better, and I know that many folks in the House are confident that we'll be able to make improvements to these bills. And one of the first improvements I'd like to make is to focus on improving the rates that are paid to rehab facilities, so that especially the nonprofit rehab facilities that we have, like Mary Free Bed and I believe another is Lighthouse across the state. Hope Network is one of those. There are rehab companies, for-profit rehab companies that are gouging, but in order to respond and control for that, we really hurt the good actors in the industry, and that's a shame. Those good actors are doing remarkable work at remarkable rates, and still leading in their level of care. We need to honor that and support that, and care for those workers, make sure they still have their jobs.
So now it appears the state legislature may be headed for a summer break while the leaders and the administration try to come up with some deal on the budget. And there is some urgency to get it done because the fiscal year for schools starts July 1st. When we come back, a final note about Lansing and the budget to the point. So now the budget negotiations begin. Well, in fairness, they've been going on, but now that everybody has passed some form of a budget or at least put out a budget plan, the leadership, the governor can all sit down and try to come up with what they're going to do about road spending. And that's where the real sticking point will be. As you know, the governor has asked for $2.5 billion in new revenue. That's a 45-cent a gallon gas tax increase. So far, the legislature has shown no interest in going along with that. So now, as we move into the summer, the question is, where can they find agreement? Can they find new revenues? Can they find money within the budget? We'll be watching each and every Sunday morning to the point.